When Claire returned to her childhood home in Vermont, the air felt too still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The funeral had ended 3 days ago, but the scent of lilies still clung to the hallway, blending with the dry sweetness of dust. She had come back not to mourn, at least that's what she told herself, but to clean, to sort, to pack away the fragments of her mother's life before they dissolved into memory. Yet as she stepped into the living room, nothing felt ready to be boxed. Every object seemed to look back at her. The pale sofa her mother used to nap on, the chipped mug that always smelled faintly of cinnamon, the old clock that hadn't ticked in years, but still hung on the wall as if time had simply paused to grieve with them. Claire set down her overnight bag and stood in the silence. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's start." Her husband, Michael, had wanted to come, but she'd told him not to. "It's just a few boxes," she'd said, pretending it would be mechanical work, not emotional excavation. But she knew he wouldn't understand the pull of this house, the ache of walking through rooms where every sound was a memory waiting to happen. She started with the study. Her mother, Margaret, had been a teacher. Books were stacked everywhere, in neat but endless towers. Claire pulled one open at random, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and found underlined sentences, notes written in her mother's careful, slanted handwriting. Truth can't stay buried forever. The irony made her lips tremble. On the desk lay a small wooden box with a brass clasp. When she opened it, she found nothing but a key. It was small, tarnished, and cold. She didn't know what it opened, but she pocketed it anyway. In the closet, behind old coats that smelled faintly of cedar and rain, she found a stack of journals, hardcovers wrapped in fading leather. Most were labeled with years: 1981, 1983, 1987, and one, tucked at the very bottom, with no title at all. She picked it up. It was heavier than the others. When she opened it, the first line made her throat tighten. "I've done something I can never explain to my daughter." Claire froze. The handwriting was undeniably her mother's, but this was something else. Margaret had been composed, precise, almost clinical in her emotions. To see that kind of confession in ink felt like reading a stranger's soul. She sat down on the floor and kept reading. "We tell ourselves we make choices for love, but sometimes love is just the name we give to fear." The next few pages were dated from the late 70s, long before Claire was born. They told of a young woman torn between two men, one steady and kind, another unpredictable but alive in every sense of the word. The writing stopped suddenly halfway down the page, mid-sentence, as if Margaret had lost the courage to finish it. Claire closed the journal, her pulse quickening. She should have stopped. She should have packed it away, respected the dead. But curiosity is its own form of grief. It disguises longing as duty. That night, she stayed in her old bedroom. The wallpaper still had faint outlines where teenage posters once hung. She sat on the edge of the bed, flipping through the journal again. Outside, rain tapped the window like nervous fingers. The more she read, the more she realized these weren't just reflections, they were confessions. Her mother had been in love with someone who wasn't her father. The entries were filled with quiet torment, pages upon pages of restraint and regret. And yet there was no bitterness, no betrayal, only a deep sense of loss. "I wish she would never know," one entry read. "I wish she could grow up without inheriting my cowardice." Claire felt a chill crawl up her spine. All her life, her mother had been a pillar of composure, calm, logical, unwavering. But here, on these yellowed pages, she was raw and terrified, human in ways Claire had never seen. The realization unsettled her. She thought of her own marriage, of how Michael had recently asked if she still loved him. She hadn't known what to say. Maybe silence had been her answer. Maybe fear really was hereditary. The next morning, she went to the attic. It smelled of dust and old paper, the kind of air that seemed to hum with unfinished stories. As sunlight fell through the slats, something caught her eye, a locked trunk tucked behind an old crib. She tried the key she'd found on the desk. It fit perfectly. Inside were photographs, neatly bound in elastic bands. Some were familiar, family vacations, birthdays, but one made her breath stop. Her mother, 20 years younger, standing on a beach beside a man who was not Claire's father. His arm rested gently on her shoulder, and they looked like two people who had promised the world to each other. On the back of the photo, written in the same careful hand, We chose silence. The words burned into her vision. Claire stared until her eyes blurred. She tried to reason with herself. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was before marriage. Maybe it didn't matter now. But the ache in her chest said otherwise. That night, she dreamed of her mother, not the older woman she buried, but the younger version from the photograph, standing on the shore, waves breaking at her feet. She wasn't speaking, but her expression was pleading, as if trying to say something Claire couldn't hear. When she woke, dawn was spilling through the curtains. The journal lay open on the nightstand. She reached for it with trembling hands. On the final written page, in ink slightly smudged by what could have been tears, was a single unfinished line. If she ever finds this, I want her to know. And then, nothing. Just empty paper, white and waiting. Claire sat frozen, staring at the blankness, realizing that the ending, whatever her mother had tried to say, had been left for her to finish. Claire didn't sleep that night. The unfinished sentence from her mother's journal echoed in her mind like a question she didn't know how to answer. If she ever finds this, I want her to know. Know what? Know who she truly was. Know what she gave up. Know what it cost her. The silence between those words felt heavier than any confession could have been. By morning, Claire had made herself coffee, though she barely drank it. The mug sat cooling beside her as she went through the rest of the trunk. Old letters, some unopened. Receipts, postcards, a pressed flower between yellowing pages. None of it made sense together, yet all of it pointed toward a life she'd never known her mother had. Her phone buzzed. Michael. She didn't answer. His voice, calm but edged, came through the voicemail minutes later. Claire, it's been a week. You can't keep hiding up there. We need to talk about us. Us. She'd stopped recognizing that word months ago. They were no longer a pair, just two people orbiting each other out of habit and fear. Maybe that's why the journal struck so deep. It wasn't just her mother's story. It was her own reflection, 30 years early. She drove into town after lunch, the sky washed gray with the threat of rain. The local library hadn't changed since she was a kid. The same smell of paper and time, the same creaking floors. The librarian, Mrs. Allen, recognized her immediately. Claire Whitman? My goodness. You look just like your mother. Claire tried to smile. I'm not sure that's true anymore. She asked about old local records, photos, newspapers from the late 70s. Something, anything, that might mention a man named John Everett. Mrs. Allen tilted her head. Everett, yes. He worked at the paper mill before it closed. Quiet man, if I remember right. Moved away. Or maybe he didn't. People fade here more than they leave. Claire found a small reference in a 1979 newspaper. John Everett, local veteran, missing after a boating accident on Lake Willoughby. Her heart jumped. The same year her mother had written about losing everything. The timing wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. She printed the article, folded it neatly, and slipped it between the journal's pages. On the drive back, she stopped at the old cemetery outside town. The road was muddy, the trees bare. She wasn't sure why she was there until she saw it. A headstone covered in moss. John Everett, 1948 to 1979. Someone had left a single stone on top of the grave, smooth and round, like the kind her mother used to collect. Claire's fingers trembled as she traced the engraved letters. What were you to her? She whispered. And what am I to you? The wind didn't answer, but she felt something stir inside her. Grief, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. That night she called her father, Thomas. His voice came through tired but steady, a man used to long silences. I was just thinking about Mom, she said softly. About how little I knew her. He sighed. Your mother kept her heart guarded. She thought protection was love. Did she ever mention someone named John Everett? There was a pause. Too long. Then no. Why? No reason, Claire lied. Just something I came across. He hesitated. Claire, be careful with the past. It doesn't heal the way we think it does. After the call, she sat in the dark for a long time. Her daughter, Emily, had texted earlier, just a single line. Are you ever coming home? The word home stung. She typed back, soon. I just need to finish something first. But even as she wrote it, she knew she didn't know what finish meant. The next morning, she called in sick to work and kept reading. The further she went, the more her mother's words shifted from confession to self-punishment. I chose safety over truth. I thought silence would protect her, but silence is its own cruelty. The guilt in those lines pulsed like a bruise through generations. Claire realized she wasn't just reading history. She was living inside its echo. Her own marriage was disintegrating under the same weight. Choices made out of fear, a life built on half-truths and quiet endurance. That evening, she walked down to the lake near the house, the same lake from her childhood summers, where her mother used to sit on the dock, reading while Claire splashed in the shallows. The surface was smooth now, gray and cold. She sat there for hours, listening to the lap of the water, wondering how much of herself she'd inherited without knowing. When she finally stood to leave, her reflection on the water looked eerily like her mother's face in the old photographs. Tired, beautiful, burdened. Back inside, she noticed something she hadn't before. The last few pages of the journal had been carefully cut out, torn cleanly with a knife. Someone had removed them. She went through every drawer in the house, searching, until she found a small envelope taped to the underside of her mother's dresser. Inside were two things: a photograph of a man holding a baby, her, and a folded letter addressed to C. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was short, the handwriting her mother's. "If you ever find this, it means you're searching for truth. But truth, my darling, is never a single thing. It's 1,000 moments you never noticed, and one choice you'll have to make. Please don't repeat mine." Claire pressed the paper to her chest, her heartbeat thudding against the words. She wanted to scream, to demand clarity, but all she felt was an ache that stretched beyond herself. That night, she dreamed of standing in front of two doors, behind one, silence, behind the other, everything she didn't want to know. She woke before choosing. When dawn came, she decided to find the missing pages. She didn't care where they led. Somewhere in those blank spaces, she believed, was the key not just to her mother's past, but to her own future. Claire drove south the next morning, the journal on the passenger seat, open to that last haunting letter. The road curved through empty Vermont countryside, where fog hung low over fields and barns leaned tiredly toward the earth. She wasn't sure where she was going, only that she needed to see the place her mother had written about in the earliest pages. The address scrawled in pencil on the inside cover read Marlowe County, Route 9, Willow Creek Farmhouse. It was nearly 2 hours away. The closer she got, the heavier her chest felt, as if she were driving not through space, but into memory itself. The farmhouse was still there, though half swallowed by weeds. Paint peeled from the porch columns, and one shutter dangled loosely like an eyelid refusing to stay open. Claire parked the car, got out, and stood staring at the sagging roofline. She half expected the air to carry her mother's scent, lavender and rain, but it was just damp wood and silence. A car pulled up behind her. A woman stepped out, mid-60s, gray hair tied in a bun, eyes sharp despite their softness. "You must be Margaret's daughter," she said before Claire could speak. "You look just like her. Except your eyes. Those are his." Claire froze. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" The woman smiled faintly. "Name's Ruth. I lived next door back when your mother stayed here. She and I used to talk over that fence there, before she stopped coming around." Ruth's gaze flicked to the journal in Claire's hands. "I see you found it." They sat on the porch steps. The wood creaked beneath them as if remembering old conversations. Ruth poured tea from a thermos and handed Claire a cup. "She loved this place," Ruth said softly, "but she was never happy here. You could tell by how she'd stare at the horizon, like she was waiting for something to come back." Claire swallowed. "Something? Or someone?" Ruth gave her a long look. "Both, maybe. There was a man, John Everett. Worked odd jobs after he came back from the war. Quiet type, polite, but you could see he carried ghosts. Your mother used to walk down to the creek with him every Sunday. The whole town whispered, but she didn't care. When he went missing, it broke her. And when she came back here months later, pregnant, she didn't speak to anyone again." The world tilted slightly beneath Claire's feet. "Pregnant?" Ruth nodded gently. "She told me she'd lost him, and then she left. Didn't even come to say goodbye. Just disappeared one night. I always wondered what happened to her." Claire stared at the journal in her lap, the words blurring. She had expected some story of guilt or love, but not this quiet rewriting of her own life. "She never said a word," Claire murmured. "Not to my father. Not to me." "Sometimes silence is how people survive," Ruth said, "but it eats you alive from the inside." They spent the afternoon walking around the overgrown property. The creek behind the farmhouse still ran clear, shallow and slow. Near its edge stood an old bench, half collapsed, and on it lay a rusted tin box, its lid barely hanging on. Claire pried it open with trembling hands. Inside were two photographs, one of her mother, smiling, her hair wind-blown, the other of the same man she'd seen before, John, holding a guitar. Beneath them, folded carefully, was a piece of paper torn from a notebook. The handwriting was Margaret's. He said the river remembers everything we try to forget. Claire sat down hard on the grass, unable to breathe for a moment. The sentence sounded like something her mother might have whispered to herself. She turned to Ruth. Was there ever a chance he survived? Ruth shook her head. The lake took him. No one ever found the body. But she never stopped coming back here for a while. Always with that same journal. Writing, crying, leaving flowers. The sky began to dim, streaked with violet and rust. Claire didn't want to leave, not yet. The air smelled like endings. Ruth touched her shoulder gently. If you want to understand her, don't just read her words. You've got to listen to the silence between them. Driving back that evening, Claire replayed every word Ruth had said. Pregnant. Creek. Silence. Her mind felt like a whirlpool pulling her backward through time. If it was true, if John Everett was her real father, then every photograph in her childhood albums was a lie built on good intentions. And yet, somehow, she didn't feel anger. Just grief for all the things unsaid between mother and daughter. When she got home, Michael was waiting on the porch. Claire, he said, voice low, careful. You've been gone all day? Emily's been calling me. Claire didn't meet his eyes. I had to see something. See what? Another grave? His words were sharp, but his face showed fear, not cruelty. You can't keep living in the past. She wanted to tell him that the past wasn't a place she was living. It was a mirror she was finally seeing through. Instead, she said, do you ever feel like you've been pretending for so long? You don't even know who you are anymore? He didn't answer, and maybe that was the answer. Later that night, while Emily slept in her room down the hall, Claire sat at the kitchen table with the journal, the torn note, and the old photograph spread before her. She compared the handwriting from the letter she'd found to the entries. It matched perfectly. There was no doubt now. Her mother had loved John Everett, and she had carried that love, and its consequences, in silence all her life. Claire whispered into the empty room, I forgive you. But her voice broke on the last word. Because forgiveness was never that simple. It demanded understanding, and she still didn't know the whole story. Somewhere out there, more of the truth was waiting. She needed to find it, not to condemn her mother, but to set both of them free. She turned to the last blank pages of the journal and noticed faint impressions of writing, as if someone had written on the torn-out sheets and pressed too hard. She shaded the page lightly with a pencil. Gradually, letters appeared, for C. If you're reading this, it means I couldn't do what I wanted to. But you can. Claire's pulse thudded in her ears. Do what? Leave? Tell the truth? Live. She sat back, staring at those ghostly words. For a moment, she felt her mother's presence, not as the distant figure who had raised her, but as a woman, flawed, frightened, human. The silence between them was gone, replaced by a fragile, aching connection. But as the night deepened, that connection turned to a realization. If the missing pages still existed, they might hold the full truth, and maybe, somewhere in her mother's old letters or her father's boxes, those pages were still waiting. Claire stood, grabbed her coat, and went upstairs to the attic again. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she knew she wouldn't sleep until she found it. Claire tore through the attic like a woman possessed, the dim bulb flickering overhead as dust swirled in golden spirals around her. Boxes, trunks, and old photo albums lay open in disarray, the air heavy with the scent of cedar and memory. Her fingers trembled as she rifled through yellowed letters and holiday cards until her hand brushed a small wooden chest tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt. It was locked with a delicate brass clasp, old but still firm. She hesitated, then grabbed a screwdriver from a nearby toolbox and forced it open. Inside, wrapped in a faded blue scarf, were several envelopes tied together with a ribbon, the same floral pattern that lined the edges of her mother's journal. Each envelope was labeled in the same looping handwriting, to John, not sent. Claire sank to her knees, her breath shallow. The first letter began with words that shook her. If you're gone, I'll raise her to be brave. Her throat closed. Her. It couldn't be anyone else. She read on, heart pounding faster with each line. The letters chronicled her mother's grief after John's disappearance, the anger toward the world that refused to find him, and the slow realization that she was carrying his child. I wanted to tell her one day, the final letter read. But how do you explain to your daughter that her father drowned for love? Claire's hands trembled as tears splashed onto the ink, blurring the words. She pressed the pages to her chest, as if they could still hold warmth from the past. The attic felt smaller suddenly, suffocating, like the weight of everything her mother had hidden was pressing down from the rafters. She couldn't stay there. She needed air. She stumbled downstairs, letters clutched in one hand, journal in the other. In the kitchen, the glow of the lamp revealed Michael sitting at the table, waiting. Claire, he said quietly, I heard you up there. What are you doing? She didn't answer at first. She placed the letters on the table and pushed them toward him. Read them, she whispered. It's all here. The truth. He hesitated, his brow furrowing as his eyes scanned the first page. The silence stretched. Then, softly, he said, Claire, what does this mean? She sank into the chair opposite him, exhausted. It means everything I thought I knew about my family is a lie. My father, my real father, he's not who I thought he was. Mom kept it all buried. And what about you? He asked gently. What are you going to do with that truth? I don't know, she murmured. But I can't keep living someone else's story. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it away. Not out of anger, out of confusion. The space between them felt different now, a quiet distance that had been growing for months, but had finally found its voice. I think I need time, she said, to understand who I am outside of all this. Michael nodded slowly, his face unreadable. Take it, he said, but don't lose yourself in her mistakes. Claire almost smiled at that, because that was exactly what she was afraid of. The next morning, she drove back to Willow Creek. The fog clung low to the ground, turning the world into a watercolor of gray and pale gold. She parked near the creek and walked down the worn path, clutching the letters. She sat on the old bench, the same one where her mother must have sat decades before, and began to read them again. Every line felt like a bridge between lives. The woman Margaret had been, the mother she'd become, and the daughter now sitting in her place. When she finished the last letter, she took a deep breath and tore the ribbon from the bundle. One by one, she laid the letters in the creek. The water caught them gently, carrying them away in fragile fragments of paper and ink. Goodbye, she whispered. A voice startled her. Beautiful, isn't it? It was Ruth, leaning on a cane, watching from the path. The river always takes what we can't keep. Claire smiled faintly. I think she knew that. Ruth nodded. She did. She came here the day before she left for good. Said she was ready to stop hiding. Claire looked down at the water. Maybe it's time I did the same. They stood together for a long while, the air filled with the murmur of the stream and the whisper of leaves. When Ruth left, Claire stayed, staring at the last flicker of white paper before it vanished beneath the current. She felt lighter somehow, as if the past had loosened its grip. But as she turned to leave, something half buried in the mud caught her eye. A metal locket, tarnished with age. She picked it up, pried it open, and froze. Inside was a tiny photograph of her mother and John Everett, their faces pressed close, smiling, unguarded. On the opposite side, scratched faintly into the metal, were the words, "For Claire, when she's ready." Her heart thudded. Had her mother come back here before she died? Had she left this for her to find? The question burned in her chest as she closed her hand around the locket. For the first time, she felt her mother not as a mystery to solve, but as a woman who had loved deeply, made mistakes, and tried in her own flawed way to protect what she loved. The wind shifted, scattering leaves across the path. Claire looked up at the sky, now a pale wash of blue, and whispered, "I'm ready." But as the words left her lips, she realized readiness was not about understanding everything. It was about learning to live with what could never be fully known. And somewhere between the water and the wind, she thought she heard her mother's voice again, soft and forgiving. "Then live, my girl. Just live." Claire drove home under a bruised evening sky, the locket cool against her palm, the road winding like a ribbon of memory. The world outside the windshield blurred, barns, power lines, empty fields, and in their motion she saw echoes of her mother's life. years of silence, sacrifice, and the quiet courage it took to keep moving. When she arrived home, the lights were off. The house felt hollow, like a paused breath. Michael's note sat on the table. Took Emily to my sister's for the weekend. We need space. Please call when you're ready. She stood for a long time, reading those words over and over. Space. The one thing she'd avoided her whole life. The emptiness where answers should be. Now she had it, and it terrified her. She placed the locket next to her mother's journal and sat down. Outside, rain began to fall, a slow rhythm against the window. Claire opened the journal to the last blank page and began to write, not as her mother had, in fragments and secrets, but in full sentences, raw and unguarded. I used to believe silence was strength. Now I see it's just another kind of fear. You built walls out of love, Mom, and I inherited every one of them. But tonight, I'm learning how to take them down. The words came easily, flowing like confession. For the first time, she wasn't writing for her mother, or for John, or even for Emily. She was writing for herself, for the woman who'd spent years trying to be a reflection of other people's expectations. She didn't notice the hours passing until dawn crept across the windowsill, staining the paper gold. The rain had stopped. A stillness hung in the house, fragile and full of promise. When the doorbell rang, she startled. Through the frosted glass, she saw Ruth standing there, her coat damp from the morning mist. I didn't mean to intrude, Ruth said softly when Claire opened the door. I thought you might like to see something. She held out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, Margaret, much younger, holding a baby wrapped in a checkered blanket. I found it after you left yesterday, Ruth said. It was tucked inside an old book. She must have given it to me years ago, and I forgot. That's you, Claire. Claire touched the photo's edge, tracing the faint smile on her mother's lips. She looks happy, she whispered. Ruth smiled. She was. That day she said she finally felt at peace. Said she wanted to stop running from her choices. Claire nodded slowly. Maybe that's what she wanted for me too. After Ruth left, Claire sat alone for a long while, holding the photograph. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum of unspoken truths. It felt alive again, trembling with quiet rebirth. She went upstairs, packed a small bag, and took the journal, the locket, and the photograph with her. Then she wrote a note for Michael. Don't worry. I just need time to see things clearly. Tell Emily I love her. I'll be back when I've figured out how to start over. She left it on the kitchen counter and walked out into the crisp morning air. The road stretched endlessly ahead. She didn't know where she was going, only that the act of moving forward felt sacred, necessary. Somewhere between the turning leaves and the rising sun, she realized that closure wasn't about tying the past neatly together. It was about accepting its knots and learning to live with their shape. By noon, she reached the edge of the lake where John Everett had vanished all those years ago. The water was calm now, glimmering beneath the autumn light. Claire sat on a rock and opened the locket again. You loved her, she murmured, speaking to a man she'd never met. And she loved you. I think she wanted me to know that love doesn't have to survive to matter. She let the locket fall into the water. It sank slowly, a flicker of silver swallowed by the deep. The ripples spread outward, breaking the reflection of the sky into trembling fragments. Claire closed her eyes. She thought of Emily, of Michael, of her mother's voice whispering through the pages. You can. And for the first time, she believed it. The ache in her chest didn't vanish, but it softened, becoming something gentler, like gratitude. She breathed in the cool air and felt the quiet hum of the world moving on. Driving back that evening, she didn't look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing there she needed to see anymore. She smiled faintly as the radio crackled to life, playing an old song her mother used to hum in the kitchen. It wasn't a sign, not a message, just coincidence. And that was enough. When she arrived home, Emily ran to her, her small arms wrapping around Claire's waist. You're back, she said, muffled against her coat. Claire knelt, brushing her daughter's hair from her face. I am, she whispered, and I'm not leaving again. Michael stood in the doorway, unsure, cautious. But when their eyes met, she saw no accusation there, only understanding. That night, after Emily fell asleep, Claire returned to the journal. She flipped past her mother's words, past the ghosts and grief, and began a new section at the back. She titled it The Things We Choose to Keep. Her first line was simple. Some stories aren't meant to be erased. They're meant to be lived differently. The pen moved steadily, without hesitation. The house was silent, but this time it was a peaceful silence, the kind that follows release, not repression. And as the moonlight stretched across the page, she felt her mother close again, not as a wound, but as a whisper of strength. For the first time in her life, Claire wasn't looking for closure. She was building a beginning. The next morning arrived with a rare stillness. Sunlight poured through the kitchen window, washing the room in gold. Claire stood by the counter, staring at the journal, her coffee untouched. She felt both hollow and whole, as if something inside her had finally made peace with breaking. The night before, she had started writing again, her words unspooled easily, as though the silence had finally given permission. But today, a different kind of clarity stirred inside her. This was not just about her mother anymore. It was about the pattern, the unspoken inheritance of women who swallowed truth for the sake of others. She wouldn't pass that silence to Emily. She wouldn't let her daughter learn love through fear. The decision settled quietly in her chest, steady as heartbeat. She packed Emily's lunch, tied her daughter's hair, and when Michael appeared at the doorway, she smiled, not the fragile, polite smile of old, but a calm, certain one. "We'll be okay," she said simply. And she meant it. After dropping Emily at school, Claire drove to the university archives where her mother had once worked part-time. The librarian, an older man with round glasses, looked up as she approached. "You said your mother was Margaret Hayes?" he asked. "Yes," Claire replied. "She used to help with the oral history project here, right?" He nodded. "She did. In fact, he rifled through a cabinet and pulled out a small audio cassette labeled M. Hayes, June 1998. This was part of her training interview. Never catalogued. Claire held the tape gingerly, her pulse quickening. "May I listen?" He led her to a back room with an old cassette player. When she pressed play, static filled the air, then her mother's voice, soft, deliberate, painfully familiar. "They asked what history means to me," the voice said. "But I think history isn't something we study. It's something we survive." Claire closed her eyes. We survive by pretending, by staying quiet, by letting the truth belong to someone else. But if I've learned anything, it's that silence doesn't protect. It only delays the ache. There was a pause, then a small laugh, faint and wistful. "I hope one day my daughter won't make my mistakes. I hope she'll write her own story." Claire pressed her hand over her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. That was it. The thing her mother had wanted all along. Not forgiveness. Continuation. Legacy without secrecy. When the recording ended, Claire sat still for several minutes, the sound of her mother's voice still echoing in her mind. Then she took the tape, thanked the librarian, and walked out into the bright afternoon, the air alive with possibility. She drove to the lake one final time, parked near the edge, and sat in silence. The water glimmered with sunlight, its surface unbroken. From her bag, she took the journal, the last few pages still blank. She opened it and began to write again. Not a confession, not a farewell, but a letter to the future. "Emily," she began, "if you ever find this, I want you to know that truth is not a burden. It's a light you carry, even when it burns. I learned that too late, but you don't have to. You come from women who loved deeply, even when they were afraid. Be braver than we were." Her handwriting wavered, but her thoughts did not. When she finished, she tore the final page from the journal, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the hollow of a driftwood log near the shore. Maybe one day, the lake would carry it away. Maybe someone else would find it. Or maybe it would stay here, a quiet offering to time. As she stood, wind rippled through the trees, bending the reeds like a sigh. The world felt wider than it had in years. On the drive home, she rolled down the window and let the wind tangle her hair. She thought of her mother, not as the shadowed figure of memory, but as a woman who had loved imperfectly and fiercely. The realization didn't hurt anymore. It felt human, grounding. When she returned home that evening, Emily was waiting on the porch steps, sketchbook in hand. "Mom, I drew something for you," the girl said, her eyes bright. Claire knelt to look. The drawing was simple, 3 figures standing by a lake, holding hands. One of them, smaller and shaded lightly in blue, stood just behind. "That's Grandma," Emily said. "I thought maybe she could be with us now." Claire's throat tightened. She brushed a hand over her daughter's hair. "She is," she whispered. More than you know. Michael came outside then, carrying 2 mugs of tea. He hesitated a moment before handing her one. How was your day? He asked. His voice held no edge this time, just quiet curiosity. Different, she said. Good. They sat together as the sun dipped behind the trees, the sky deepening into indigo. The silence between them felt soft now, no longer a wall but a bridge. Michael reached for her hand. You found something out there, didn't you? He asked. Yes, she said. But not what I expected. I thought I was looking for her story. Turns out, I was finding mine. He smiled faintly. Then maybe it's time we write a new one. Claire looked at him, then at the house behind them, glowing gently in the evening light. Maybe it is. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Claire took out her mother's journal one last time. She flipped through the pages, stopping at a place where the ink had smudged, where her mother's tears had once fallen. She traced them lightly, then closed the book and placed it on the shelf beside her own notebook, a quiet symmetry between generations. The past was still there, but it no longer owned her. She stepped outside, barefoot, onto the grass. The air was cool, alive with the scent of rain and pine. Above her, stars began to appear, scattered and shy. She lifted her face toward them and whispered, "Thank you." Not to the sky, not to anyone in particular, just to the space between what was and what could be. In the distance, an owl called, and the world seemed to exhale. Claire turned back toward the house, where the soft light of her daughter's night lamp glowed through the window. Tomorrow would bring the same routines, breakfast, school runs, work, but everything inside those moments had changed. She had changed. Before going in, she took one last look at the horizon. The line between night and dawn shimmered faintly, endless, alive. The ache that had once defined her now felt like something else, a pulse, a reminder. Her mother had carried silence like armor. Claire would carry truth like a seed. And maybe, when Emily grew older, she'd plant her own story in turn, one not born of pain but of understanding. The wind brushed past, gentle and cool, like a final word carried from another time. Claire smiled. She didn't need to know if it was real. Some messages, she realized, don't have to be read, they just have to be felt. And as she stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind her, the house filled not with ghosts, but with light.